Finally, today, let's talk about how cultural bias impacts our language choices. Cultural bias is a skewed way of viewing or talking about a group of people that is typically very negative. And this culturally biased language can make reference to one or more cultural identities, including race, gender, age, sexual orientation, and ability. And much of our biased language is actually based on stereotypes and myths that influence the words that we use. And a lot of times there's this worry in the back of our heads about being politically correct. And political correctness takes this awareness of our cultural biases to an extreme, but it doesn't do much to address the actual cultural bias aside from making people feel like they're walking on eggshells. And oftentimes this kind of pressure can lead people to avoid discussions about cultural identities or really just avoid people with different cultural identities altogether, which isn't very productive. So we're going to talk about these cultural biases and how they can sneak their ways into our language and how we can try to be more inclusive in our language choices. So the first cultural bias that I want to talk about is regarding race. And when it comes to race, there are all sorts of different labels and euphemisms that we use in order to attempt to describe groups of people. So for example, we use terms like white or person of color or black or Asian American or whatever else you have. And those labels can be really important to individuals. But in addition to those labels, we also tend to use a lot of euphemisms for race that illustrate bias right within them. So a good example of this is when we compare, let's say, urban voters to suburban voters. The words urban and suburban are euphemisms for Black or voters or people of color and white, right? So urban usually refers to people of color, whereas suburban usually refers to whiteness. And there's a bias that is implicit in that because you are comparing the urban group to a different group, right? So the suburban group. And we're looking at like the norms that are perpetuated by our language as well here. And so when it comes to using race and looking out for our cultural bias in race, it's important for us to remember that some people who have racial identities other than white, including people who are multiracial, use the label person of color or people of color to indicate their solidarity among groups. And in some cases, they also use more specific labels when referring to a specific individual or referring to a specific racial group. And we've been seeing a lot of conversations about this surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement and whether we should refer to individuals who have those darker skin tones that usually come from Africa but can come from other places as Black or as African American. And the recent decision on this, I suppose, or the recent conversation on this is that we should be using the term Black because it is often more accurate than African American tends to be. When I was growing up, the politically correct phrase to use was African American, and I couldn't even tell you the reasons why necessarily, but the term African American doesn't describe all of the people within that racial group because yes, a lot of people within that racial group did have ancestors who came from Africa, but a lot of times they don't know where in Africa because many of these people descended from slaves who were stolen from their homelands and don't know where they came from. But additionally, a lot of Black people don't have descendants from Africa. Instead, they have descendants from the Dominican Republic or from Haiti or something along those lines. And so the term African American isn't even accurate in that case. And similarly, along the same lines, when it comes to the Native people in this country, recently we've adopted the term Native American or Native peoples as opposed to saying American Indians, for example. And this is because the term Native American Indians, again, was inaccurate, right? The only reason that we called Native people Indians to begin with was because Christopher Columbus thought that he had landed in India and called them Indians, right? And he was incorrect in that. But the label stuck for all of those years, all of those decades and centuries, where Native people or Native Americans is a much more accurate label. But the long story short here is that if you're ever unsure of the label that you should use, and if you're trying to avoid that cultural bias, do a little bit of research. Go to Google, right? We have all of these tools at the tips of our fingers, and we can look these sorts of things up. But it is also important for us to have those conversations with people in our lives and to ask them what labels they prefer to use to describe themselves as well. So the next cultural bias group that I want to talk about is with gender. And our language has a tendency to exaggerate the perceived differences between men and women. And generally speaking, men are still seen as the quote-unquote dominant group. And so in order to avoid this cultural bias, we should do things like avoid the use of the generic he when referring to something that is relevant to everyone. So as an example, we might say that if a student wants to study, he should go to the library. That sentence leaves out a significant number of students who don't use he as a pronoun, right? And so in order to be more accurate and more inclusive, we can say if students want to study, they can go to the library, right? This includes not only male students, but also female students and students who don't identify as either. And so we can use pronouns like they and their as opposed to using his or her to include more people into the conversation. And similarly, we have these really lasting gendered associations with certain occupations that have tended to be male or female dominated. And so, for example, if you think of a doctor, you probably think of a man, whereas if you think of a nurse, you probably think of a woman. But in reality, there are more female doctors nowadays and more male nurses. And so we have to check those preconceptions and check those biases whenever they are sneaking in. And even the words themselves can be gendered sometimes. For example, the distinction between waiter and waitress, right? We know that a waiter is a male individual who is serving the table at a restaurant, whereas a waitress is a female individual who is serving the table at the restaurant. But this is an arbitrary distinction. It doesn't need to be made. And so instead of saying waiter or waitress, we can simply say server or waitstaff. Similarly with mailman, right? Mailman assumes that it's a man who is delivering the mail. And so instead we can call them the postal worker or the mail carrier, right? And try to avoid those gender biases altogether. Another place where a bias seeps in is with age. So language that includes age bias can be directed towards younger and older people. So typically, descriptions of younger people often assume recklessness and inexperience, whereas descriptions of older people assume frailty or disconnection. And even the term elderly, for example, has some negative connotations, right? The word elderly refers to people over the age of 65, but it has these connotations of weakness or frailty, right? Whereas if we were to use the word older people instead, it doesn't really have those same negative connotations. So again, we're just checking our biases here. Next, let's talk about sexual orientation. Generally speaking, our society tends to be very heteronormative, which essentially means that our language contains bias in which heterosexuality is assumed. So this means that if we are looking at a man, we assume that he probably has a female partner, whereas if we are looking at a woman, we probably assume that she has a male partner. That's what heteronormativity is. And the way that we check our bias with this one is to simply make sure that we don't make those assumptions, right? Because if you're looking at a man, you have no way of knowing the gender of his partner. And similarly, if you're looking at a woman, you have no way of knowing the gender of her partner. Hell, you have no way of even knowing whether or not they think of themselves as a man or woman, right? And so instead, we can use gender neutral terminology like partner or spouse to avoid that biased language. But in addition, the LGBTQ community tends to prefer certain labels like gay, lesbian, bisexual, as opposed to saying homosexual. Because historically speaking, the term homosexual was used in really clinical settings and was actually used to describe a psychiatric disorder up until the 1970s. And so many people see the word homosexual as being too clinical in that way and think that it refers to the sex act more than the identity itself. So we tend to use the word gay or lesbian or bisexual as opposed to homosexual. And then finally, the last cultural group that we're going to talk about is ability. So people with disabilities make up a really diverse group that has increasingly become viewed as a cultural or social identity group. And a lot of the time, the bias that creeps in here is that people with disabilities are compared to quote unquote normal people, which implies that there is an agreed upon definition of what normal is and implies that people with disabilities are abnormal in some way. But this definition of normal just doesn't exist, right? My definition of normal is different from your definition of normal, which is different from the definition of normal for someone else. And so to make this comparison is inaccurate. And in addition, generally speaking, we tend to want to refer to people with disabilities as a person with a disability as opposed to a disabled person. And this is all about putting the person first and making sure that we are not putting the disability before the person, right? Because the individual is not their ability or their disability. That is not the entirety of their identity, right? And so, if they are a person who uses a wheelchair, or if they are a person who is hearing impaired or sight impaired, that does not make up their whole personhood, right? They are just a person who happens to have a disability. And so we can use these really slight tweaks in our language to make sure that everyone feels like they are included and that they are not otherized. And that's true of all of these different cultural groups, right? Whether it's race, gender, age, sexual orientation, or ability, we can make these small tweaks in our language to check that cultural bias and make sure that we are including everyone.